The exhibition was a provocation. It was like a move in chess, which had several targets at once. It was a trap set for the intelligentsia, which included a trap for me, because I had won lots of competitions. And it was also meant to provoke Khrushchev into repression.
He didn't like, he didn't understand avant-garde art. He liked opera, classical music, folk music, realistic art where one could see a forest and know it was a forest. The ideologists told him he was very wise not to understand it, because behind it, bourgeois ideology is penetrating our pure society, and it could all end up rather badly.
Писатели — это артиллеристы, это артиллерия, потому что они, так сказать, расчищают путь для нашей пехоты. Образно говоря, прочищают мозги тому, кому следует. Поэтому бить точно, но бить по противнику, по своим не стрелять.
The censors stifled free speech in other parts of the Soviet Empire. In Czechoslovakia, where a rigid Stalinist leadership blocked all reform, the struggle was the same, the free-thinking artist trying to elude the party censor. In those years, Václav Havel began to write for the theatre.
To criticize communist ideology was like suicide. It was better to find another way, to write about human rights, human freedom, and basic human existence, rather than enter into a direct confrontation with ideology.
You know, the censorship itself, that's not the worst evil. The worst evil is, and that's the product of censorship, is the self-censorship. Because that twists spines, that destroys my character. Because I have to think something else and say something else. I have to always control myself. I am stopping to being honest. I am becoming hypocrite. And that's what they wanted. They wanted everybody to feel guilty.
Whatever went wrong, the communist system itself must never be blamed. Khrushchev had still not solved the problem of food supply. But he was buoyant about his grand schemes. He ordered everyone to grow corn, claiming, wrongly, that new Soviet varieties could survive in cold climates.
The
poor girls and boys had to warm up the fields day and night so that the corn would grow. They burnt fires all through the night, especially if a frost was forecast. Sometimes they fell asleep too close to the fire and burnt their hands and faces. So the corn for us was not the queen of the fields, but an evil stepmother. When they couldn't save the crops, despite burning the fires, the boys would put on a brave face. But the girls cried bitter tears, because the crop had died.
In 1963, the harvest failed. There were bread shortages and renewed rationing. Wheat had to be imported from the West.
At least we'd always had bread before. But when suddenly it disappeared, thanks to him, Khrushchev was cursed. But only at home. In the streets, you had to keep quiet. But at home, even though my father was a communist, he used to swear and curse Khrushchev because he made life much more difficult for us.
The Soviet people, officials and citizens alike, were losing patience with Khrushchev. His great plans all seemed to end in calamity. Khrushchev's peasant boisterousness amused the West, but it shocked Russians. They found him clownish, irresponsible. Over Cuba, he had nearly blundered into nuclear war.
He caused unrest among the party elite. Almost everyone was dissatisfied with him, but for various reasons. These could be personal, or because of the constant reforms he introduced and then cancelled, or his unsuccessful moves in politics. Of course, personal reasons played a part too. A lot of people were afraid that he would undermine the stability of the system.
The fruit was overripe. We had to decide quickly, before the fruit fell and started to decay and infect society, because then society would start to rot. That is why we made the decision to depose Khrushchev. It was done quietly, without any blood.
The Politburo selected Leonid Brezhnev to lead the attack on Khrushchev. In October 1964, Khrushchev was deposed.
I met him. He gave me his briefcase, and he never touched it again. He said, "It's all finished. I resign." When they all went into lunch, I left. I didn't want to join them. I don't think they actually invited him to have lunch anyway. He was in a state of nervous stress. He had tears in his eyes. He was very unsettled. He couldn't find a place for himself. He would go to the dacha, come back, sit around. It was a month and a half before he gradually calmed down.
Few people missed Khrushchev. Many wanted a firm hand on the tiller again.
Everybody was satisfied with the wiser, more sensible position taken up by the new leadership, and by Brezhnev in particular. That was our first impression. It was more acceptable to the people because it was more stable. Before that, the situation had been uncertain, and we didn't know what would happen from one day to the next.
Stability was restored in the Soviet Union, but unrest stirred in the empire. In Czechoslovakia, the repressive regime of Antonin Novotny still stamped on demands for a more open society.
They tried to push back the progress of freedom, but they didn't succeed anymore. We made 2 steps forward, and we were repressed by 1 step, but we gained 1 step always.
By February 1968, the Czechoslovak reformers were taking over. Brezhnev flew to Prague to size up the new leader, Alexander Dubček. Brezhnev accepted that some change was inevitable. Alexander Dubček seemed a loyal communist who would alter only what was necessary. By March 1968, Dubček and the new president, Ludvík Svoboda, were in charge, but their reforms were already shocking the rest of the communist world. The reformers were confident that they could bring communism up to date. The party would still lead, but by consent, not force. There would be freedom to speak and write, to travel and organize. There would even be a form of market economy. Dubček's vision was named Socialism with a Human Face. One of the first changes was the ending of censorship. Suddenly, the papers were full of truth, revealing the crimes of Stalinist Czechoslovakia. Everywhere, crowds gathered in anxious debate. After 2 decades of terror and silence, Czechs and Slovaks had found their voice.